You are listening to a sermon from the First Baptist Church of Ewing, a Christ-centered church in Lewis County.
So I think that we could all agree that appearances can often be deceiving. The time that I think I understood that the most was the first time that I ever visited the Dead Sea. I'd heard, of course, many stories about the Dead Sea, knowing that it's supposed to be one of the saltiest bodies of water in existence. The salt content is so high that no plants or animals can live in it. And I even remember that as I approached the sea, there was all of these rows and rows of rinse stations, because if you got too much salt in your mouth or on your eyes, it could burn. But as I was standing there just looking at the Dead Sea, it was so clear and inviting. There was this perfect breeze that was blowing through the air, all of these pristine palm trees, beautiful beaches. It kind of just made me feel like I was in an oasis. And so perhaps, despite my better judgment, as I stood there admiring my surroundings, I decided to begin sprinting across the beach. And there was this dock, and I ran down the dock, and I jumped into the air, and I decided it would somehow be a good idea to cannonball into the Dead Sea. And instantly, it felt a lot like someone had taken my eyes and put them into a deep fryer. I didn't close my eyes, I didn't hold my nose, and so I had salt water in every orifice of my face, and everything burned. And I kid you not, I came out of that water probably as blind as Saul on the road to Damascus. I couldn't see a thing. And what had appeared to be refreshing had turned out to be anything but. What had appeared inviting had ultimately been deceiving. And though we don't usually care to admit it, far too often as humans, we have very similar experiences where we allow ourselves to be fooled by appearances. And as we study this passage in 1 Samuel chapter 16, we'll see that the Israelites are especially aware of this reality of how appearances can be deceiving. So let me read our text for us. 1 Samuel chapter 16, I'm going to read verses 1 through 13. It says, "The Lord said to Samuel, 'How long will you grieve over Saul, since I have rejected him from being king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and go. I will send you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided myself a king among his sons.' And Samuel said, 'How can I go? If Saul hears it, he will kill me.' And the Lord said, 'Take a heifer with you and say, I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. And invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will show you what you shall do. And you shall anoint for me whom I declare to you.' Samuel did what the Lord commanded and came to Bethlehem. The elders of the city came to meet him, trembling, and said, 'Do you come peaceably?' And he said peaceably, 'I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Consecrate yourselves and come with me to the sacrifice.' And he consecrated Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice. And when they came, he looked at Eliab and thought, 'Surely the Lord's anointed is before him.' But the Lord said to Samuel, 'Do not look at his appearance or at the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord sees not as man sees. The man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. Then Jesse called Abinadab and made him pass before Samuel, and he said, "Neither has the Lord chosen this one." Then Jesse made Shammah pass by, and he said, "Neither has the Lord chosen this one." And Jesse made 7 of his sons pass before Samuel, and Samuel said to Jesse, "The Lord has not chosen these." Then Samuel said to Jesse, "Are all of your sons here?" And he said, "There remains yet the youngest, but behold, he is keeping the sheep." And Samuel said to Jesse, "Send and get him, for we will not sit down till he comes here." And he sent and brought him in. Now he was ruddy and had beautiful eyes and was handsome. And the Lord said, "Arise, anoint him, for this is he." Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brothers, and the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon David from that day forward, and Samuel rose up and went to Ramah. So if you were here last week, we saw that the Israelites crossed into Canaan and began to conquer the Promised Land. But if you know anything about their story, shortly after they settled in, they soon demand a king that the Lord would provide for them. They want him to provide for them a king like all of the other nations around them have. And these demands are ultimately a rejection of the Lord God as their true king. The Lord is gracious to give the people Saul to rule over them. If you know anything about Saul, we're told about him in 1 Samuel, back in chapter 9, verse 2, that he was a handsome young man, and there was not a man among the people of Israel more handsome than he. From his shoulders upwards, he was taller than any of the people. But Saul's outward appearances are deceptive because they only serve to mask Saul's inward disobedience. By the time we arrive here to 1 Samuel 16, you see that the process has already begun to replace Saul because he has been rejected by the Lord. The Lord rejects the heart of Saul in order to find a new king that will seek after the heart of God. And that's really the main idea for our consideration this morning. The reality that rather than looking at appearances, the Lord looks to the heart. Particularly, the Lord looks to the heart for any of those who are aspiring into roles of leadership, but he also looks into the heart for all who aspire to be a faithful follower of him. So this morning, we're first going to turn our attention to Saul and why looking outwardly at superficial appearances is insufficient. And then secondly, after we look at Saul, we're going to look to David to see why looking inwardly at the heart is much better. But we're also going to look at the life of David and see why even looking inwardly at the heart is still not quite enough. So let's first turn our attention to Saul. And let's see why looking outwardly is insufficient. The first verse of chapter 16, it's noted that the Lord has rejected Saul from being king over Israel. And to really understand that rejection, you've got to back up to the previous chapter to see why he was rejected. Chapter 15, Saul is commanded to lead his men in a fight against the Amalekites. And verse 3 tells us that he is not to spare them, but kill both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. Now, this story, in a lot of ways, is similar to what Joshua and the Israelites faced during the Battle of Jericho. If you remember anything about that story, Joshua and his men were called to devote everything in Jericho to destruction. As the first city in Canaan that Joshua conquered, Jericho was meant to be set aside as a sort of offering to the Lord, since he had granted this victory to his people. But as you may recall, there is a man by the name of Achan who hoards for himself some of the spoils of that battle. He buries some gold and some silver and a robe, and it causes terrible consequences, not just for him and his family, but for the entire nation. Saul, in chapter 15, is very similar to Achan. He is commanded to devote everything of the Amalekites to destruction. It says, man, woman, child, infant, ox, sheep, donkey. The Lord knows that if there is any aspect of this culture or this civilization that remains intact, the wicked sins of the Amalekites will only serve to act as a snare to the Israelites. But, like Achan, Saul does not do as he was told, and he withholds a portion of the spoils won during the battle. Now, there's an interesting twist to the story, because he doesn't set aside those spoils for himself. He actually sets apart the oxen and the sheep in order to sacrifice them to the Lord. So he disobeys the Lord for a good cause, but he still is disobedient nonetheless. So rebuking his actions, in verses 22 and 23, Samuel, he says this to Saul. He says, has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to listen than the fat of rams. For rebellion is as the sin of divination, and presumption is iniquity and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has also rejected you from being king. So Samuel says to Saul that obedience is better than sacrifice, even sacrifices that were intended to be an act of worship. But because those sacrifices ultimately caused Saul to reject the word of the Lord, now Saul is being rejected by the Lord. So let me pause here for just a moment to see what kind of wisdom we can glean from the warning that you see from the kingship of Saul. First, I think that chapters 15 and 16 here warn us not to select leaders based upon any kind of appearance or performance. Saul was young, tall, and handsome. He had zeal, and he got things done. Yet, he was rejected because he rejected the word of the Lord. You cannot look upon individuals simply because they have passion. You can't look to leaders simply because they are young and full of energy. A pastor may be culturally relevant, charming, charismatic, He may draw in the crowds, but if he has rejected the words of the Lord, then those crowds are going to exit those sanctuary doors just as spiritually lifeless as when they first entered. The church may have more people, more programs, more money, but having rejected the Lord, they will be spiritually starving and hurting and poor. Secondly, though, I think that this text serves not just as a warning to leaders, but it means that if you shouldn't select leaders based upon appearance or outward performance, then you shouldn't evaluate yourself based on that criteria either. If you look back on the life of Saul, he had an astounding resume. I mean, just after he was anointed as king, he raised up an army of over 300,000 soldiers to march out and victoriously defeat the Ammonites. But outward performance is not the same as inward integrity. If you want to evaluate your life, don't ask yourself what you've done. Ask yourself who you are. Don't just ask yourself what you have done, what you have accomplished. Ask yourself who you are. Anytime I read through the qualifications for pastors and deacons, as seen in 1 Timothy and Titus, I'm always struck by how seemingly ordinary those qualifications are. Be sober-minded, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable. Don't be a drunkard or violent or quarrelsome or a lover of money. As you read these, you see that these aren't just qualifications for being a pastor or being a deacon. These are really just qualifications for being a mature Christian. Church leaders aren't held to a higher standard than the rest of the congregation. They're held to the same high standard as the rest of the congregation. So don't just seek out leaders of a high moral caliber. Realize that you are to be held to those same high moral standards. And the true test of your maturity in Christ has nothing to do with outward appearance or outward performance, but it has everything to do with your inward obedience. So you've seen the life of Saul and how looking outwardly is insufficient. Secondly, let's dig into the heart of this chapter and turn to the life of David. And in doing so, you'll see how looking inwardly at the heart is infinitely better, but we're also going to see how looking inwardly at times still isn't quite enough. So in 1 Samuel 16, Samuel is commanded by the Lord to seek out Jesse the Bethlehemite, because the Lord has provided Israel a king among his sons. Notice the phrasing there. The Israelites aren't choosing another king based upon their own standards. This new king is being provided by the Lord. I think that should clue you into the reality that this king is going to be markedly different than Saul. And at first, Samuel is hesitant because though Saul has been rejected by the Lord, he is still technically king. And if Samuel anoints another to take his place, then he and that new king could both be killed by Saul. But nonetheless, Samuel is faithful and does all of that the Lord has requested. he travels to Bethlehem and he meets Jesse and his 7 sons. And one by one, each of these sons passes before Samuel. And one by one, the Lord makes it known that he has not chosen any of these men. Even Eliab, as he passes by, the firstborn, Samuel thinks to himself in verse 6 that surely the Lord's anointed is before him. But the Lord reminds him not to look on his appearances or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. So finally, Samuel has to ask Jesse if all of his sons are present, because no one that has stood before him has been chosen by the Lord. And Jesse admits that there remains the youngest, but behold, he is keeping the sheep. And so Samuel calls for David to be brought in from the field, and the Lord tells Samuel to anoint David with oil because it is he who has been chosen as king. He's not the oldest, he's not the tallest, he's not the biggest, yet the Lord has looked on the heart of David, and in doing so, he has seen a man after God's own heart. Let me just pause there again. Take another moment to see what we are to make of this story. I think it's a little too easy, maybe almost a bit trite even, to say that because the Lord looks inwardly to the heart, that therefore you should as well. I mean, you don't have X-ray vision. You can't see on the inside. You can't hear what is going on in someone's head. So what should we take away as a response to this text? How do you look inwardly at the heart of someone as the Lord did? I think going back to the qualifications of leadership that you see in 1 Timothy and Titus that I was speaking about a moment ago, I think that that's one of the reasons why it says that deacons must first be tested, and why pastors should not be a recent convert. Because you can't see the heart, you have to carefully wait and carefully watch in order to observe actions that reveal the heart. As Jesus put it this way in Luke chapter 6, verse 45, he said, "Out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks." What's on the inside will eventually work its way to the outside, given enough time. So if it's on the inside, Jesus says it will eventually come out. So as a church, as we seek to disciple others and we seek to raise up more godly, faithful leaders, I think it's okay, and sometimes maybe even good, to proceed at a almost glacial pace. Because it's better to be slow and choose leaders with a heart after God than be quick and choose leaders whose heart will later reveal nothing but selfish or wicked intentions. I think this passage also has implications for how we view new converts in a church as well. I think far too often we are eager to take an individual who has walked down an aisle or said a sinner's prayer, and we just assume that those outward actions are indicative of that genuine inward change. There's a Southern Baptist pastor by the name of Mark Dever who I have a lot of respect for. And he said that anytime a new believer comes up and tells him that he or she has just come to the faith, his response is almost always, "We'll see." He just says, "We'll see," not to discourage them, but because of the realization that you can't actually peer into the heart or the soul of an individual to see if that gospel has actually taken root or sprouted. So you simply have to wait to see as the gospel works its way up through the soil and to see if it will grow and produce spiritual fruit. But if you're too quick to affirm the work of the Spirit in someone's life without actually seeing any of the fruit of that Spirit, you can run the grave risk of giving someone this sense of false assurance where there should be no assurance. So through the kingship of Saul, we've seen how looking outwardly is insufficient. We've also looked through David, and we've discussed why looking inwardly, as much as we can as humans, looking inwardly at the heart is better. But lastly, this passage also foreshadows that even looking inwardly at the heart is sometimes not quite enough, because ultimately every human heart harbors sin. So even if you can look internally inward at the heart, every human heart is ultimately going to harbor sin in its own way. I want to look back at verse 12 for just a moment. I think this is a very interesting verse. We're told that Samuel, he sent out and he brought him in, that's David. And David, he was ruddy and had beautiful eyes and was handsome. Now, Samuel was just told a moment ago not to look at appearances because the Lord looks at the heart. It seems odd then that as David is brought in, that we are told that he is handsome with beautiful eyes. Well, why is this physical description added into this story? Saul had the physical appearance of a natural-born leader. He stood head and shoulders above all of the other Israelite men. But if anything, his physique only served for him to find his demise faster. People trusted him because he looked like a man in charge, but he didn't have the moral capacity or character to back it up. And now we see with David, though he's not tall like Saul, he is physically attractive in his own right. And I think that this description functions as a foreshadowing to the temptations that are later one day going to plague David's life, and for which he is going to be famous for, because David will be just as susceptible to fixating on outward appearances. When he finally becomes king, there will be one day when David is walking on his own roof rather than fighting out in battle with his men, and this handsome king will peer across the way and will see a beautiful woman, and what follows will nearly wreck David's personal life, his professional career, and even his entire kingdom. He not only commits adultery, but then he goes on to commit murder to cover up that adultery. And then eventually the events spiral out of hand until you have this catastrophic civil war against David and his own son Absalom, who ironically enough is also praised for his handsome appearance. Studying the lives of the Old Testament kings sometimes can be a depressing endeavor. You look to the life of Saul and you see how he failed. You look to the life of David, though he's a man after God's own heart, even he fails, and so do his sons. And these stories, as you read them, they just leave you searching and hoping for something more. Because even though David's heart was better than Saul's, at the end of the day, every human heart is wicked in its own way. But fortunately, we're not left to our discouragement for long. We're not left to search for forever. Though we see much failure in the lives of the kings of Israel, we are also given hope of the arrival of a future king who will one day rule for all eternity. I think the prophet Isaiah foreshadows this arrival the best. Isaiah chapter 11, verses 2 and 4. Isaiah says this. He says, "There shall come forth a shoot from the stump of Jesse, and a branch from his roots shall bear fruit. And the Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord. And his delight shall be in the fear of the Lord. He shall not judge by what his eyes see, or decide disputes by what his ears hear. But with righteousness he shall judge the poor, and decide with equity for the meek of the earth." Because David's heart was imperfect, though he became king, eventually his kingdom will be cut off at the stump. Israel and Judah will eventually fall as a tree falls in the forest, and nothing will be left behind but a small remnant of a broken stump. But Isaiah reminds you that that stump will one day grow a shoot. And the name of that shoot from that stump of Jesse is Jesus. And just as the Spirit rushed upon David at the time of his anointing, the Spirit of the Lord will rest upon Jesus as well. And unlike David, unlike Saul or Absalom or any other king, Jesus will be a forever king who will not judge with what his eyes see or what his ears hear. He will judge through his perfect righteousness as he looks into the heart of man. And on this side of the cross, you and I are fortunate enough to see that Christ's kingdom has been inaugurated. And because of that ultimate reality, there really is no one who rules but Christ. Though a pastor may serve as a shepherd, Jesus is ultimately the shepherd. Though a president may hold office, ultimately it is Jesus who reigns. And because he is a king who has power over even death, and because he has conquered even the grave, you can put your faith and trust in him because he will not fail. Saul failed, David failed, every other king failed. Jesus, this forever king, will not. So this morning, I began by talking about how looks can so often be deceiving. What outwardly may appear inviting may inwardly be deceptive. Or what outwardly may not be the biggest or the tallest may inwardly house a heart that seeks after the heart of God himself. My prayer for us this morning, today, as a church, is that we would be a people that understands why looking only outward is insufficient, and why looking inwardly at the heart is infinitely better. But I also pray that we would see that even looking inwardly is not enough. We must ultimately look to Christ. He is our one and only hope. He is our one and only King. Let me pray.